Hello, my name is David Brett. I'm coming to you today from New Westminster City Hall to ask you this question. Should land acknowledgements in this province and across the country be scrapped, be eliminated? My answer is yes. Now, this question came to prominence recently when MP Wade Grant took to social media to mock Member of Parliament Aaron Gunn, who is a Kamloops and Powell River area, because Aaron Gunn had asked a question via social media as to whether it's wise to continually recite words like unceded territory when the province in particular is gripped in this question of private property rights in the wake of the Cowichan decision, which seems to upset and upend property rights, this context of DRIPA and everyone extremely worried about property rights. So in response, some of the chiefs of, for example, of the Qayqayt First Nation were mocking Aaron Gunn, saying, "Chillax, bud," kind of putting him down. And then Wayne Grant took to social media saying land acknowledgements are symbolic and innocuous, and the chiefs were saying MP crashes out over harmless land acknowledgements. Are they really harmless? I say no. There's actually a lot of harm that comes from these land acknowledgements, and I'm going to give you an example from right here in New Westminster, just how convoluted and kind of confusing, misleading, and to some extent disingenuous land acknowledgements are actually hurting Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people as well. So let's just delve right into it. I'm going to read the New Westminster Land Acknowledgement that before every City Council meeting is read this statement. I'll just read the whole thing. We recognize and respect that New Westminster is on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Halkomelem-speaking peoples. We acknowledge that colonialism has made invisible their histories and connections to the land. As a city, we are learning and building relationships with the people whose lands we are on. So, here's the problem. I'm now going to read you the land acknowledgement that is published by the New Westminster School District. Keep in mind, one of the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was that Canadians be better educated, that particularly school children be educated as to Indigenous culture and what's going on with Indigenous people. Well, here's the New Westminster School District land acknowledgement. New Westminster Schools recognizes and acknowledges that the Qayqayt First Nation, as well as all Coast Salish peoples on whose traditional and unceded territories we live, we learn, we play, and do our work. So, hold the phone. New Westminster City Hall, which is dominated by the same political party as dominates and runs the New Westminster School District, says the Halkomelem-speaking people, whereas the school is saying all Coast Salish peoples. So who are the Halkomelem-speaking people? Well, that's potentially the Cowichan, the Kwantlen, all of the Stolo peoples, the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh. So those people? And who is the Qayqayt First Nation that this New Westminster School District is acknowledging? Well, the Qayqayt First Nation, for people who are not from New Westminster, is what's called the New Westminster Indian Band. Like a lot of bands, they officially changed their name to the Qayqayt First Nation. But why is it the City of New Westminster does not acknowledge the New Westminster Indian Band? Are we confused yet? And why does the New Westminster School District acknowledge all Coast Salish peoples? That's very far and wide. We're talking about the Squamish. We're talking about a very, very large population of Indigenous people that somehow we're going to acknowledge them as well. So, to complicate matters even further, the provincial representatives of the provincial government came to town recently, the BC Housing, when they were announcing the tiny home complex to the great surprise of residents and businesses throughout the town. Well, of course, they felt compelled to read their own land acknowledgement, and I'm going to read that to you as well. We acknowledge with gratitude that the area we are discussing today is situated on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples, again, overly broad, and, get this, specifically recognized as belonging to the Qayqayt First Nation, as well as the territories of the Halkomelem-speaking peoples of the Coquitlam, Musqueam, Katzie, Stolo, Tawasin, Kwantlen First Nations. Okay, let me repeat that part here. Specifically recognized as belonging to the Qayqayt First Nation. Okay, well, if that's what the provincial government's position is as to who owns, who this land quote-unquote belongs to, well, they should get on the phone to the federal government. Or at least they should read this article published in the New Westminster Times back in September of this year. It says, Canada seeks dismissal of all Qayqayt First Nations New Westminster land claims. All. So according to the federal government, the Qayqayt First Nation doesn't even really exist. It's not a First Nations people. Now, to give you a little more background on the Qayqayt First Nation, not many people outside of New Westminster really know the story. Back in the 90s, someone named Rhonda Larrabee discovered that her mother wasn't really Chinese. She was actually an Indigenous person. Her dad was Chinese. And she discovered finally, to make a long story short, that her ancestors had come from New Westminster and lived on a reserve in New Westminster down the hill over here near Poplar Island. So she felt very inspired, and she reconstituted the New Westminster Indian Band and made herself the chief, and the band basically consists of her and her family members and a few others, and they have a land base of 0. Not 1 square inch of land does the Qayqayt First Nation have. So, whereas the provincial government is saying the land belongs to the Qayqayt First Nation, the New Westminster School District is acknowledging the Qayqayt First Nation. The New Westminster City Hall doesn't recognize them at all. Now, wouldn't this be rather confusing to the public? And also kind of set back reconciliation? Now, full disclosure, I actually know Chief Rhonda Larrabee, and I worked with her on a project back in 2017 when I was the president of the Hayek Festival Association, which runs the whole parade during the Hayek Festival here, and we collaborated on this, I thought, amazing reconciliation-themed event for the year. We had a First Nations canoe, and we really kind of formed a relationship. So it seems weird that the city of New Westminster has kind of thrown her under the bus, whereas the school and the province seem to think that she's the bee's knees. Now, even in the city's current documents, when they want to show themselves to be, involved with First Nations people, her picture will pop up. She'll be at ceremonies. She comes to May Day. She comes to every ribbon cutting going. And she's the kind of go-to First Nations person in the city of New Westminster for ceremonies. But will they even acknowledge her? I guess not. So, here's the other aspect of the New Westminster land acknowledgement that I'd like to delve into a little bit. It's this part where it says, as a city, we are learning and building relationships with the people whose lands we are on. Well, what does that mean, building relationships? How are they doing that? Relationships with who? Exactly what? So now, to my point, this is why these land acknowledgements should simply be given up upon. It is not, we can't expect bureaucrats and elected officials to get this right. They're bungling it. They can't even decide, get their story straight from the province to the school board to the City Hall, even though they're part of the same political party. New Westminster is dominated by the NDP. Same thing with the school board. Same thing with the government in Victoria. Who's advising them? Are they doing their homework? Are they looking up the facts now? Here's some news. There's things that you'll learn by following the New Westminster Times you won't learn anywhere else. Now, this business of the Qayqayt land claim, let me talk about that a little bit. So, the Qayqayt First Nation put before what's called a Specific Claims Tribunal. This is not going to the Supreme Court or the provincial court. This is a tribunal set up specifically for claims that are for monetary compensation only, that are less than $150 million. It's a lot of money, but under $150 million. So, the Qayqayt contends that there were reserves set aside here in the 1800s for the New Westminster Indian Band. Now, this kind of ties into the Cowichan decision because think about it. New Westminster is the oldest city in Western Canada, the original capital, and it was formed by Governor Douglas and Colonel Moody around the time when the Cowichan alleged that their reserves should have been set up. Well, the fact of the matter was that, according to the Government of Canada, their case is, well, Indigenous people were coming to New Westminster from all over British Columbia. Why? For jobs, for work. There was all kinds of work happening here. There was industry, there was the gold rush, there was fishing, there was canneries, there was sawmills, there was all kinds of work. So what the Commissioner Sproat did is he set aside certain areas of New Westminster for Indigenous people to live and predominantly camp. It was a seasonal situation. So the story is that the government's position is that these reserves were provisional and that they were not for any specific nation, and that the New Westminster Indian Band was what's called a composite band. It was a band for administrative purposes only that was kind of designated to cover all of the various people, maybe from the Cowichan. Were the Cowichan coming to New Westminster instead of going to their traditional village because it was, well, there was services here and there was jobs here? They were coming from all over to here. So the government is saying, no, the Qayqayt people is not a distinct nation or people group, and the New Westminster Indian Band was a composite band. So the news about the Qayqayt First Nation that you're not going to hear anywhere else but the New Westminster Times is this. Since the article I put out in September of 2025, there's two new rulings came down from the Specific Claims Tribunal. And it's very interesting. Number one, the Government of Canada brought a motion to dismiss the Qayqayt claim entirely. They said this has no merit whatsoever. they haven't brought the proper evidence, they haven't done anything right. They pled a lot of things about their ruling that says this is even worth hearing. Well, the judge in the case at the tribunal ruled against Canada, saying no, they're able to amend their claims and present the evidence that the government of Canada is saying is missing. And so anyway, it was a lengthy ruling against the government of Canada. So what that means is the trial, this claim will proceed. Then the Qayqayt First Nation brought its own application to have the matter heard on a summary basis. So when things are heard on a summary basis, what that means is that the judge rules based on documentary evidence only. In other words, stacks of documents, affidavit evidence. There's no parade of expert witnesses into a room to provide testimony and to be cross-examined on that testimony. Such summary trials are typically brought or followed when it's more of an open-shut case. That, hey, we don't need to go through this rigmarole like the Cowichan case with its 500 plus days of hearings with so many expert witnesses in this. So the whole point is to shorten the length of time, to have a protracted process shrink. So the Qayqayt Nation says, no, wait, folks, this has gone on too long. They originally brought their claim back in 2012. They're saying, let's get on with it. Well, the judge ruled against them. There's no summary trial going to proceed. So Canada lost its application to dismiss, and Qayqayt lost its application to have a summary trial. So what does this mean? It's back to square one. They're going to proceed through the Specific Claims Tribunal with a more lengthy hearing process. So who knows? It could be another couple of years before we really learn, will the reserve lands at Poplar Island be deemed to have been properly, should have been given to the Qayqayt First Nation, or there was a couple of other reserves. There's 2 lots over where the BC Pen used to be that they claim should have been theirs. Or will it be some negotiated settlement worked out and the Qayqayt First Nation will have a happy ending, whereas now they've got next to no money whatsoever and absolutely no land? Will this process finally turn out well for them? So that's the news you won't hear anywhere else regarding that particular part of the story. You can see the problem with these land acknowledgements is that the federal government, the provincial government, the municipal government, the school district is completely on different pages as to what's going on, and they're just making these pronouncements. So that's all wrong. So this part about the relationships, how are they actually creating these relationships? Well, the Westminster School District made a big deal after they, several years ago, that they were to build these relationships, they hired an Indigenous Relations Manager. Now, who is this Indigenous Relations Manager? I just want to talk about this Indigenous Relations Manager in the city of New Westminster for a minute. So her name is Christina Coolidge, and on her LinkedIn page, she describes herself this way: member of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, Cree Scottish Métis from Treaty 6 territory, and Danish. So she has a master's degree from Simon Fraser University, which, full disclosure, I went there. I have a master's of MBA from SFU, so I'm not going to really knock SFU, but it is well known to be rather left-leaning. So she comes here, and one of the first speeches she made in council was that she felt this kind of trepidation. It said this was the first time she'd ever worked in a colonial institution. As if just even working here was going to expose her to some kind of harm. Well, As of the end of 2024, per city disclosed information, she's making $140,000 a year. So that's something. So effectively, the Indigenous Relations Manager here is Métis. Well, it just so happens that one of the city councillors here in Westminster, Daniel Fontaine, who is running for mayor, is also Métis. But wouldn't you know it, the NDP-dominated city council here are constantly upbraiding this man and bringing a lot of judgment against him. In fact, Daniel Fontaine is not greatly respected for his Métis heritage. In fact, he's brought a claim before the Human Rights Commission that he was fired from his Métis Nation job for, quote, not being Métis enough. And one of the councillors here, there's an article about this in our paper by Amy Ham, the very woke city councillor Nadine Nakagawa, compared Daniel Fontaine, who's Métis, to Donald Trump. Said he's bringing Trump-style politics to our city, and she accused him of inciting violence against her. You can read all about it in the New Westminster Times. But here's the irony. You have an Indigenous Relations Manager who's effectively Métis, and a city councillor who's Métis, and they don't seem to... One is simply sort of put on a pedestal as somehow creating these wonderful relationships across the region with their various people. And I really wonder if it's being done. So finally, to kind of bring home the point, is that the problem is that the land acknowledgements are part of, they're kind of the leading edge of a sort of a disinformation campaign. I'm sorry to have to say that. But that's what it ultimately ends up being, where politicians are trying to position themselves as experts or leaders or on building bridges of reconciliation with Indigenous people, when really they're positioning a political themselves for a political advantage by hiring people and making statements that will reflect well on them. So, to give you a flavor of the kind of morass this whole system puts us in, I'd like to read a few words from one of the first speeches that the Indigenous Relations Manager made behind me in City Hall in Council Chambers a few years ago. Now, she very bravely shared that she went through the 12-step program to overcome substance abuse, and I applaud her for that. Now, if she had just left it at that, that'd be one thing, but then she launched into a very strange oration to sort of stake out her position on how the society should behave and what the agenda was going to be here in the Westminster. And I would say what she said reflects a lot of what the Indigenous kind of activist talking points are, and that has caused a lot of consternation and kind of dissolved the good faith of the non-Indigenous community with the Indigenous. I'll just read it. She says, "We as a society and as a city are addicted to the effects of colonization." So she's sort of positioning the society in the context of the 12 steps. That society itself is sick with addiction. She says, money, power, resources, consumption, it makes us feel good. But after a while, it's not enough. And we need more and more and more. You can see the links to the concept of addiction. It's like, okay, society, admit it. You're a hopeless addict who has lost control of themselves and need to wean yourself off colonization. She says, this is what we in the 12-step program call a spiritual malady. So think of it. The society at large is sick inside. Our addiction has made us spiritually sick inside, and it's killing us. Now, how does this manifest? She says things like the opioid crisis, the affordable housing crisis, and the climate crisis. So in other words, all of society's ills flow out of quote-unquote colonization, and that we're addicted to it. And the entire society is in this malaise. So then she says, it goes on and on. It's a long speech, but she says, this journey is to heal ourselves and the spiritual malady, because it is not Indigenous people who are sick. What we were doing is detoxing from colonization. We were decolonizing. Think of that. We are detoxing from colonization. We are decolonizing. Now, this puts me in mind, on our homepage, you'll find an article that says, white people are subhuman. Now, to bring it back to the beginning, this chillax bud kind of insult thrown out at Conservative Member of Parliament Aaron Gunn came from none other than the Qayqayt First Nation. And this man, Maynard Harry, a former highly respected chief of the Qayqayt First Nation, who runs a seminar called Colonizer Rehab. Sound familiar? This concept that we need to rehab, sort of get off of this poison called colonization. So in other words, everything we have in this society, like, well, cars, restaurants, grocery stores, the wonders of the industrial society, medicine, hospitals. This is all something we need to detox from. So nothing is very well specified. So the Qayqayt folks, you can see how the threads come together. The land acknowledgements are part of what I call, and we should call, gaslighting. That's what's happening here. If you think that there's something wrong with land acknowledgements, and you just they don't sit right with you, you are right. You do not need to chillax bud. You need to listen to that inner voice. Listen to your kind of common sense. Why are we acknowledging that these lands are unceded and this is at the very, very crux of this issue. We are now, the courts in this land have heretofore held that when the Crown grants land rights in fee simple, they're indefeasible. In other words, it's yours. End of story. Now the Couch decision is rolled in and says, wait a minute. It's not indefeasible, it's defeasible. It could be defeased. If people in Canada, in British Columbia in particular, are upset about this suddenly defeasible land, they should not be accepting words like unceded, because what does that mean, unceded? Does the Crown own the Crown land or not? And furthermore, land acknowledgements tend to be extremely generalized. I mean, these are the most generalized. All Coast Salish people, all Halkomelem-speaking people. Like, who are the people? It's so non-committal. It's kind of hypocritical when you think about it. We're not going to commit to the Qayqayt First Nation or the chief of the New Westminster Indian Band. We're not going to say anything about that because, oh, whoa, that might get us. It's a non-committal commitment to nothing. It is part of a smokescreen, if you will, of misunderstanding, misinformation, disinformation, to create an unstable view of what our society is based on. So, if it rankles you to hear land acknowledgements, especially when they're constantly repeated, and this is something that happens often at conferences, there'll be a land acknowledgement at the beginning, and then the speaker will come up and do another land acknowledgement. It happens all the time in these council chambers here. You'll have them repeated over and over, and they're slightly different or extremely different. So, with that, be interested to know what you have to say in the comments. And look up what Aaron Gunn said about land acknowledgements. Raise the issue. Nobody knows when the next provincial election or federal election is going to be exactly. But one thing we do know for sure is that in October of this year, there's going to be elections for city council and mayor, the school trustees. These civic elections are happening in October, and that's a certainty. And that's, I guess, the final message I have is that a lot of the land acknowledgements in this kind of shaping of policy that happens at the local level come from city halls and school board offices. They don't necessarily come down from on high from the province or the federal government. They're the ultimate arbiters of what happens. But the public perception and the mindset is set often here in places like New Westminster City Hall. So those are my thoughts on land acknowledgements. So my name is David Brett. I'm the editor of the New Westminster Times. If you like our journalism, you want to support our work, I invite you to do so. On our website, newwesttimes.com, up in the right-hand corner, there's a button that says support our work. If you would feel so inclined, we would greatly appreciate it. We do have costs. It is not free to do what we do. If you want more independent voices in journalism, it has to be supported. We're not the mainstream media. We don't have the kind of resources they do. So your support is much appreciated, and I thank you very much for watching. Have a great day.